Saipan, July 1944. The island burns beneath a gray Pacific sky. Smoke coils through shattered palm trees as distant gunfire fades into the wind. Inside a jagged cave near the island's northern cliffs, a small group of Japanese women huddle in silence. Nurses, clerks, and civilian mothers who had followed the Imperial Army. Their uniforms are torn, their faces streaked with soot and salt. Outside, American voices echo, calm, unfamiliar, calling softly through megaphones. Come out. You will not be harmed. But inside the cave, the women tremble. For years, they had been told that capture meant violation, torture, and death. Some clutch small bottles of poison. Others hold the hands of frightened children. A whisper breaks the silence. Trembling, almost inaudible. They're going to us. Another woman pulls her child close. But as footsteps approach, what enters the cave is not cruelty. It's a young U.S. medic, holding out a blanket and a small stuffed bear. The women freeze. Reality fractures. What they had feared most never comes. And that moment, that single act of human kindness amid ruin, would echo across the last, desperate months of the Pacific War. Before a single American set foot on Japanese soil, the imperial government had already built an invisible fortress, not of stone or steel, but of belief. From the late 1930s onward, propaganda coursed through every newspaper, schoolbook, and radio broadcast in Japan. Its message was absolute. The enemy is inhuman. The Imperial Ministry of Information painted Allied soldiers, particularly Americans, as savage monsters. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of Western troops, bayoneting children and mutilating women. Teachers told schoolgirls that capture meant lifelong disgrace, that women taken by the enemy would face unspeakable violation. Even elementary drills prepared civilians for mass suicide rather than surrender. By 1943, this narrative had become unshakable truth. To die for the emperor was noble. To be captured alive was shame. Women were especially targeted by this indoctrination. Members of the Taishantai, volunteer nursing and clerical corps, were trained to serve near the front lines, but also instructed to keep grenades or poison for honorable death. Mothers were told to kill their children before the enemy could defile them. These were not isolated fears. They were policy, formalized through military directives and reinforced by years of propaganda art and cinema. Meanwhile, few in Japan had any real understanding of the outside world. Wartime isolation had sealed off foreign media, and the only images of Americans most citizens ever saw were filtered through imperial censors, crude cartoons of grinning devils. Even whispers of humane treatment by Allied forces were suppressed or branded as treasonous lies. By the spring of 1944, this ideological armor began to crack, not from disbelief, but from pressure. The war that once stretched gloriously across Asia was collapsing inward. The U.S. Navy's island-hopping campaign had leapt across the Pacific, crushing Japanese garrisons one by one. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein. Each fall carried rumors of annihilation, of civilians who died by their own hands rather than face capture. Then came Saipan, a speck of volcanic rock in the northern Marianas. Saipan was more than a battlefield. It was the last shield before the Japanese homeland, a place the emperor's advisors declared must never fall. Its beaches bristled with bunkers and artillery, its caves packed with supplies and thousands of civilians, farmers, nurses, government workers, and families evacuated from smaller islands. As U.S. Marines and soldiers stormed the island in June 1944, imperial propaganda reached its fever pitch. Leaflets dropped by the Japanese military warned the people, "The Americans are beasts. They will burn your skin, kill your children, and laugh as you scream." Loudspeakers in the villages echoed the same lines. To surrender was unthinkable. When the battle began, those words became prophecy for thousands. Families threw themselves from cliffs at Marpy Point, mothers clutching infants as they fell into the sea. Soldiers detonated grenades against their chests. Entire medical units drank poison in their bunkers rather than be dishonored. To Western observers, it appeared as madness. But to those inside that world, it was obedience, the final act of loyalty in a war of myths. And yet among the smoke and gunfire, some chose to live. Some hid in the caves for days, starving, listening to the shouts of American soldiers searching for survivors. Their minds were torn between terror and exhaustion, between the words they'd been told and the faint hope that maybe the enemy wasn't what they believed. The imperial myth of the merciless enemy had reached its breaking point. And what happened next, in the caves of Saipan, would begin to dismantle years of fear, one human encounter at a time. By late June 1944, the island of Saipan had become a graveyard of imperial promises, what the Japanese High Command had called the impregnable Fortress of the Marianas was now being methodically destroyed. U.S. naval artillery pounded the island day and night. The sky burned with tracer fire and smoke. Each explosion marked not just a military defeat but the crumbling of an entire worldview, the illusion of invincibility that Tokyo had promised its people for years. Among the tens of thousands on Saipan were roughly 25,000 civilians, including women who had been brought from Japan and Okinawa to support military operations. Nurses, clerks, teachers, and government workers. Some were wives of officers. Others were teenage girls serving in auxiliary medical corps. They were civilians by status but soldiers in spirit, bound by duty, propaganda, and fear. The battle began on June 15th, when over 8,000 U.S. Marines stormed the beaches under withering fire. By the end of the month, organized Japanese resistance was shattered, but the survivors, both military and civilian, refused to surrender. They vanished into the mountains and caves that riddled the island's northern half. To them, capture was worse than death. From those dark caverns came the muffled sounds of crying children and whispered prayers. American patrols, many of them young men barely out of high school, approached cautiously. What they found shocked them. Instead of soldiers, they discovered entire families. Starving, dehydrated, terrified. Mothers begged to be killed, convinced that what awaited them outside was worse than any bullet. On July 7th, the final organized Japanese attack collapsed in a suicidal banzai charge, one of the largest of the war. Over 4,000 soldiers hurled themselves against entrenched American lines. When it was over, silence fell across the island, broken only by the sobs of survivors hiding in the hills. As American medics and interpreters combed through the caves, they carried leaflets printed in Japanese, assuring civilians that they would be treated humanely. But few believed them. Propaganda had convinced many that humane treatment was a cruel trick, a lure before slaughter. Still, hunger and desperation began to erode the fear. Women emerged one by one, waving scraps of white cloth, towels, undershirts, even baby garments. Some collapsed from exhaustion the moment they stepped into the light. U.S. soldiers, trained for combat, now found themselves holding canteens instead of rifles. They wrapped the women in blankets and called for medics, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of antiseptic. For the Americans, these rescues were acts of duty, humanitarian gestures in a war that had already taken too many lives. But for the Japanese women, the experience was something almost incomprehensible. The enemy they had been taught to fear as beasts now offered them food, water, and bandages. Some wept uncontrollably. Others stared in silence, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they'd believed. Witness accounts from Marine Corps medics and Red Cross personnel describe the same haunting pattern: disbelief, then tears. One nurse later recalled how she had hidden poison in her sleeve, ready to die if touched, only to find herself being handed chocolate and a small, stuffed toy for a frightened child beside her. That image, a teddy bear in a soldier's hand, would become a quiet symbol among those who witnessed Saipan's aftermath. To the Japanese women, it was not just a toy. It was proof that everything they'd been told about the enemy had been a lie. In the weeks that followed, American units established makeshift refugee centers for women and children. Doctors treated burns and malnutrition. Interpreters tried to explain that they were safe. Some refused to sleep, fearing it was all an elaborate trap. Others prayed, uncertain whether to thank or fear their captors. By August, Saipan was declared secure. Nearly 22,000 Japanese civilians were dead, most by their own hand. But over 15,000 were found alive, many of them women and children who had emerged from the caves only after the fighting ended. For these survivors, the war did not end with surrender. It began anew, as they confronted a world that was no longer built on fear, but on fragile, uncertain humanity. And from the ashes of Saipan, their stories spread across the Pacific, to Guam, to the Philippines, and eventually to Japan itself. Stories of survival, kindness, and confusion. Stories that challenged everything the Imperial Army had made them believe. The myth had shattered. But the truth, the human truth, was only beginning to surface. The human fear in the final years of the Pacific War. Fear became a weapon more powerful than any rifle. It seeped into every home, every classroom, every whispered conversation under curfew. The Japanese Empire had mastered it, shaping emotion into obedience. For most women of wartime Japan, survival was not a right, but a duty to the emperor. From the moment they could read, schoolgirls were told that their bodies were extensions of the nation itself. In classrooms adorned with portraits of Hirohito, teachers warned that a woman's greatest honor was purity, and her greatest shame was capture. The word fujin no fusei, the woman's disgrace, carried a moral weight so heavy that even rumors of Allied occupation triggered mass hysteria. By 1944, surrender was not just military defeat. It was spiritual annihilation. Propaganda made sure of it. Pamphlets, circulated among nurses and auxiliaries, described American soldiers as white wolves, men who took pleasure in defiling women and torturing prisoners. The stories were specific, horrific, and false, but repetition made them real. In hospital tents across the Pacific, Japanese medics kept hidden doses of morphine or cyanide, meant not for patients but for themselves. One captured diary from a nurse in Guam contained a final line written before she fled into the jungle. "If the Americans come, I will die before they can touch me. That is my last service to the emperor." This mindset was not born of cowardice. It was cultural programming, the outcome of years of isolation, censorship, and imperial religion. Even in the final months of the war, when food vanished and cities burned, Tokyo's radio broadcasts still painted the enemy as inhuman. "Better death than shame," the announcers repeated. When Saipan fell and the women who survived hid in the caves, they were not merely avoiding capture. They were defending their identity as loyal subjects. The terror they felt was not momentary. It was generational. And yet, fear is fragile when faced with reality. The first time a U.S. medic approached a cave, holding out food and speaking gently through an interpreter, the moment cracked open something ancient and immovable. Witnesses recall how women screamed, covering their faces, waiting for the assault that never came. One woman, later interviewed by a Japanese journalist in 1946, said, "He gave me water. I thought it was poison, but when I drank, I realized I was still alive." The psychology of surrender for Japanese women was more than the acceptance of defeat. It was a collapse of faith. Everything they had believed about morality, virtue, and loyalty dissolved in a single human gesture. Compassion was not supposed to exist in war. Yet here it was, undeniable, disorienting, and deeply confusing. American medical units noted that some women resisted even after being rescued. They refused food, refused to speak, sometimes even attempted suicide days later. The fear did not vanish overnight. It decayed slowly, replaced by silence and tears. For the U.S. troops, many of them young, exhausted, and equally traumatized, these encounters were bewildering. The soldiers had fought through jungles, lost friends, and seen the brutality of war. But now they were being asked to hold crying mothers, to treat malnourished children, to become caretakers to the very people they had been trained to kill. In field hospitals, Japanese women were treated for burns, infections, and malnutrition. Nurses from the U.S. Navy's Medical Corps often reported that the women would flinch at any approach, whispering "Yamete kudasai," please stop, even when bandages were applied. It took time for them to realize the hands touching them meant help, not harm. This human angle reveals the deepest irony of the Pacific War. Propaganda had stripped both sides of each other's humanity. The Japanese saw the Americans as monsters. The Americans, after Pearl Harbor and years of savage fighting, saw the Japanese as fanatics. Yet in the caves of Saipan, that illusion cracked open. Kindness became an act of resistance. Not against an army, but against the logic of war itself. A Marine offering a child a teddy bear was, in its quiet way, a defiance of everything the war demanded. No victory banner, no propaganda broadcast could have undone that single moment of human contact. And as more women emerged from hiding, the story spread quietly among the survivors. The enemy gave us food. They treated the children. They did not harm us. Rumors of mercy began to travel faster than fear. But on the American side, another transformation was taking place, one that revealed as much about the conquerors as it did about the conquered. The other side of mercy. For the Americans who fought across the Pacific, war had been stripped of romance long before Saipan. They had seen it at Tarawa, where waves of Marines were cut down on open beaches. They had seen it in the jungles of Guadalcanal, where disease claimed more lives than bullets. To them, the Japanese soldier had become a figure of relentless fanaticism, an enemy who refused surrender, who fought until death. By 1944, the U.S. military's propaganda machine had mirrored Japan's in its own way, branding the Japanese as ruthless, alien, and cruel. Leaflets, training films, and war briefings painted them as a faceless threat, a race conditioned for obedience, incapable of mercy. That was the image young Marines carried into Saipan. What they found instead, hiding in the caves, forced them to see something they were not trained to see: humanity. American combat medics were often the first to encounter Japanese civilians. Moving through the ravaged hills with translators and stretchers, they found women holding infants, clutching photographs, whispering prayers. The fear in those women's eyes was unmistakable, a raw, primal terror that no weapon could silence. Many resisted being touched. Some tried to flee deeper into the caves. Sergeant Robert E. Moore of the 27th Infantry Division recalled in a post-war interview, "They wouldn't come out. You could tell they thought we were devils. So one of the guys took his helmet off, smiled, and showed he had candy in his hand. That's what did it. One little boy came out first." Moments like that were small, almost trivial in the scale of the war. Yet to the men who lived them, they were unforgettable. Marines began carrying small tokens, bits of ration chocolate or trinkets left behind by their own families. Anything that could calm a child. The teddy bear, passed from one unit to another, became one such object. No one remembered exactly who brought it first. A medic from a hospital ship, perhaps. But it appeared in photographs taken by war correspondents after Saipan's fall. A Marine crouches beside a Japanese girl holding out a toy bear. Behind them, smoke still rises from the cliffs. That image, unposed, unscripted, would travel home to America as a quiet counterpoint to the brutal headlines. In the middle of one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific, compassion had found a place to exist. Yet for many soldiers, mercy brought its own burden. They had lost friends in the same battle. Some had seen the mass suicides at Marpy Point, mothers and children leaping into the sea. The sight haunted them. One Marine wrote in a letter, "I thought I hated them. After what I saw, I couldn't. They were scared to death of us." American medical reports describe the strange silence in those camps. Women rarely spoke. Children watched every movement with suspicion. Some women bowed repeatedly, murmuring "sumimasen," apologies for being alive. Others broke down when treated by female U.S. nurses, believing they were witnessing something unreal. women on the enemy's side, offering care rather than condemnation. For the American guards and medics, these moments blurred the line between victory and guilt. Here were the faces of an enemy they had been told was barbaric, now pale, trembling human. Some soldiers found themselves questioning the war entirely. "You realize what propaganda does," one Marine said later. "It makes you forget they're people." Then something like that. A woman crying over a teddy bear. It just breaks you. But not all encounters were gentle. War had hardened many beyond empathy. Some soldiers refused to engage, fearing booby traps or ambushes, and some civilians did detonate grenades when approached. Mercy in war was never universal. It was fragile, born in the narrow space between exhaustion and conscience. Still, as word spread of women being rescued rather than killed, the tone among American units shifted. Orders were issued to treat all Japanese civilians humanely, to offer medical aid and food when possible. Red Cross personnel documented these efforts, noting that many rescued women eventually began assisting the Americans, cleaning wounds, translating or helping care for other survivors. In that paradox, conquerors and conquered working side by side, lay the quiet power of the story. These women had been taught that Americans would destroy them. The Americans had been told that Japanese civilians would never surrender. Both were wrong. The caves of Saipan became a place where those lies died. Together, the soldiers who witnessed that transformation carried it long after the war. In letters, memoirs, and oral histories, many spoke not of the battle's triumphs, but of the haunting mercy they had offered. For them, it was not a gesture of superiority, but of reconciliation, a glimpse of humanity beneath the noise of empire and ideology. And for the Japanese women, those gestures became the first fragile steps toward survival, and eventually, reflection. Because soon, the war would reach its most violent climax, and the lessons of Saipan would be tested again, on an even more desperate scale. July 9, 1944. The northern cliffs of Saipan were quiet, but not peaceful. Smoke lingered like a heavy curtain over the jagged terrain. The fighting had ended in most areas, yet hidden caves still held survivors, mostly women, children, and elderly civilians. Their supplies were gone, their bodies weakened by days without food or clean water, and in their minds, death seemed inevitable. Lieutenant James H. Carter led a small detachment of Marines into one of the larger cave complexes near Marpy Point. He had been briefed that civilians might be present. But the stories of mass suicide left him uneasy. Each step echoed against stone, punctuated by the distant cries of infants and murmured prayers in Japanese. Then, a voice, trembling, almost inaudible, whispered from the shadows, "They're going to us." Carter froze. A small, pale hand emerged from the darkness, followed by the head of a young woman, hair matted and streaked with soot. Behind her, several others appeared. Mothers clutching infants, nurses in ragged uniforms, girls no older than 16. Every face was etched with fear, every eye wide with disbelief. The Americans lowered their rifles. Carter raised his hands, speaking slowly through an interpreter. "You will not be harmed. Come forward. Food and water are here." It took hours for the first group to leave the cave. Some clutched their children tightly, refusing to release them. Others pressed small items into the hands of the soldiers, family heirlooms, photos, scraps of paper, as if offering tokens to the unknown. A U.S. Navy medic, Petty Officer Clara Simmons, approached with blankets and rations. One young mother flinched instinctively, pressing a hand to her chest where she had hidden a capsule of poison. Simmons knelt, placing a small chocolate bar and a stuffed toy beside the child, whispering, "It's okay. You're safe now." The moment stretched, fragile as glass. The child hesitated, then reached for the bear. The mother's hands trembled. No one spoke. There was no cheering, no triumph, only relief, disbelief, and tears. That single act, offering a toy, food, or water, reverberated across Saipan's hidden survivors. Word passed from cave to cave. The Americans do not intend to harm us. Mothers unclenched their grips on children. Some of the nurses whispered prayers of thanks, unsure whether they were thanking the soldier, the gods, or simply fate. The surrender was neither dramatic nor violent. There was no parade, no captured banners, no fanfare. It was quiet, human, intimate. And in that intimacy lay its power. These women, trained and indoctrinated to believe capture was worse than death, discovered that reality could defy fear. Field reports from the 27th Infantry Division describe the scene in detail. Over 50 civilians rescued in one cave alone, ranging from teenagers to women in their early 40s. Many were near collapse, covered in dust and soot. Water and first aid stabilized them. Translators reassured them that surrender did not mean punishment. For the first time in weeks, they ate. Outside the caves, Marines noted the peculiar fragility of their own emotions. Some soldiers wept quietly while distributing rations. Others wrote in letters home about the surreal contrast. The women's terror against the backdrop of safety, the innocence of children cradled in uniformed arms, and the sheer improbability of mercy amid carnage. Even for those still hiding, news spread quickly. Whispered rumors moved faster than any propaganda. They will not harm us. They give us food. They care for the children. By mid-July, the majority of surviving Japanese civilians on Saipan had emerged. What remained were small pockets of soldiers and die-hard loyalists who refused surrender. But the women's experience had already rewritten the narrative of fear. The myth of the merciless enemy had been shattered in the quietest way, through simple, human acts of compassion. Yet this was only the beginning. Saipan's caves offered a controlled glimpse of mercy, but the Pacific War was far from over. Across the islands, in Guam, Tinian, and Okinawa, the chaos and brutality would intensify, testing the limits of fear, humanity, and survival. The moment of first contact was decisive not because of strategy, not because of weaponry, but because it proved a truth stronger than propaganda. Fear could be disarmed by trust, cruelty could be met with kindness, and even the most indoctrinated minds could begin to believe in humanity again. By mid-July 1944, Saipan's northern cliffs were quiet in the aftermath of battle, but the caves held echoes of terror and confusion. The women who had survived the relentless bombings and suicidal directives of their own military now faced a new reality. The enemy they had been taught to fear was offering mercy. Corporal Thomas Green of the 2nd Battalion remembered entering one cave. At first, they didn't move. Their eyes were wide, staring. They were expecting the worst. Then we brought out water and blankets. One woman fainted from exhaustion, and the baby she held started crying. We gave her chocolate and a small teddy bear. The look on her face, I can't describe it. Relief, disbelief, gratitude, all at once. The teddy bear became a quiet emblem of this paradox. Innocence delivered into a war-torn world. Photographs taken by Red Cross observers captured the surreal intimacy. A small Japanese girl clutching a plush bear, while her mother crouched beside her, tears streaming down her face. For these women, the bear was not a toy, but a symbol of a reality they had never imagined. Safety, humanity, and care from those they had been taught to despise. Medical teams moved through the caves, treating malnutrition, burns, and untreated infections. Nurses whispered gently, sometimes kneeling to meet a frightened gaze. Women who had been trained to commit suicide rather than surrender now accepted care, sometimes for the first time in weeks. Many refused to speak, but their trembling hands and hesitant smiles told their stories. And yet while trust began to take root on Saipan, the broader Pacific conflict raged on. Okinawa, the Philippines, and other islands awaited. And the lessons of Saipan would soon be tested on a larger, more harrowing scale. When the guns fell silent across the Pacific in 1945, the war had ended in name, but its echoes persisted for those who had survived. The Japanese female POWs of Saipan emerged not only from caves, but from a profound confrontation with fear, indoctrination, and the unexpected humanity of their captors. Interviews conducted by the U.S. Army and later by Japanese historians reveal the enduring psychological effects of these experiences. Many women reported persistent nightmares, anxiety, and flashbacks, the trauma of both the battlefield and the years of propaganda that had shaped their perception of the enemy. Yet alongside this, nearly all testified to the shock and gratitude of encountering genuine compassion. One former nurse, writing in a 1946 memoir, described the surreal moment a U.S. medic handed her a teddy bear for her child. "I had prepared to die. I had memorized the words to thank the Emperor with my last breath. Instead, they gave us bread, blankets, and a toy. I did not know how to respond. I still cannot fully explain it." Such testimonies were repeated across Saipan and later in other camps. Women who had initially hidden, resisted, or contemplated suicide found themselves slowly adjusting to survival. The American emphasis on humane treatment, consistent medical care, food distribution, and reassurance facilitated a remarkable psychological transition. Fear, once absolute, was replaced by cautious trust. The broader historical implications were equally significant. Red Cross reports from Saipan documented the stark contrast between Japanese fears and the reality of Allied treatment. These reports highlighted the efficacy of humane policies in stabilizing populations, reducing resistance, and mitigating potential atrocities. In doing so, they became part of the archival record demonstrating that compassion could be a strategic as well as moral tool in warfare. For the women themselves, the experience remained a touchstone for the rest of their lives. Many returned to Japan carrying the memory of kindness alongside trauma. Some became advocates for post-war reconstruction and nursing programs, citing their experiences under U.S. care as foundational to their understanding of professional duty and human empathy. Others spoke privately to relatives of the profound dissonance between indoctrinated fear and lived reality. The psychological impact extended to cultural memory as well. Families recounted stories of teddy bears, chocolate, and blankets handed to children as symbols of hope in a time of despair. These objects, simple, tangible, human, became enduring icons in the personal histories of survivors, representing the moment when fear gave way to trust. Historians analyzing these events emphasize that Saipan's civilian experience illustrates a rare intersection of warfare and humanity. The encounter between indoctrinated fear and deliberate kindness produced outcomes that challenged prevailing narratives of the Pacific War. Rather than being annihilated by fear, the women adapted, survived, and carried forward a testimony of compassion that contrasted sharply with the widespread brutality of the conflict. In later decades, survivors of Saipan would recount these stories to researchers, journalists, and family members. Their reflections are consistent. Fear had been pervasive and all-consuming, yet humanity had broken through in small, decisive acts. The bears, the blankets, the chocolate. Each gesture became emblematic of a broader truth. Even in war, individuals have the capacity to choose empathy over cruelty. By the end of 1945, the surviving women had not only endured, but also contributed to a subtle yet profound historical lesson. Saipan had demonstrated that compassion could dismantle fear, that trust could replace indoctrination, and that even amidst one of history's deadliest conflicts, moments of humanity could persist. And as the war receded into history, these experiences would shape personal narratives, influence cross-cultural understanding, and stand as a quiet testament to the enduring power of kindness in the most extreme circumstances. War is often measured in territory gained, weapons deployed, or lives lost. But the story of the Japanese female POWs on Saipan reminds us that its quietest moments, the ones often overlooked, can hold the deepest truths. In the caves of Saipan, fear had been absolute. Decades of indoctrination, reinforced by propaganda and military orders, had convinced women that capture meant dishonor, suffering, or death. Yet in the face of that terror, small acts of compassion, a blanket, a ration of food, a teddy bear, created a space where humanity could re-emerge. It was in those gestures, seemingly minor in the scale of war, that life triumphed over fear. The significance of these moments extends beyond the island's cliffs or the duration of the Pacific War. They illustrate a timeless truth. Even amidst destruction, cruelty is not inevitable. Empathy, patience, and care have the power to counteract indoctrination and to foster trust where none existed. For the women who survived, these encounters became enduring touchstones, proof that even the most feared enemy can offer protection, and that acts of kindness can shape the course of human lives as profoundly as any battle. The story also holds a lesson for history itself. It challenges the simplicity of enemy and ally, reminding us that people cannot be reduced to stereotypes or propaganda. Soldiers, civilians, conquerors, and captives are all human first, capable of fear, courage, and compassion. The contrast between indoctrinated terror and lived reality on Saipan reveals not only the brutality of war, but its potential for moments of grace. Ultimately, the teddy bears, the blankets, and the food were more than objects. They were symbols of trust restored, of fear confronted, and of humanity surviving amidst chaos. They remind us that history is not only written in statistics or strategy, but in small, intimate moments that reveal the capacity for good in the worst of circumstances. As the sun set over Saipan in July 1944, the women who had whispered in terror, "They're going to us," learned a lesson far older and more enduring than any war. That human compassion, however fragile, can survive even the darkest chapters of history. And in that survival lies the quiet, unshakable hope of humanity itself.